The avoidant has controlled the entire relationship through their comfort with distance, their willingness to withdraw, their ability to remain emotionally disconnected while you remained invested. They held all the power because you pursued while they retreated, because you worked to maintain connection while they maintained defended position, because you feared losing them while they appeared indifferent to losing you. The avoidant could withdraw knowing you would bridge the distance, could create space, confident you would fill it with your effort, could remain unavailable, secure in the knowledge that your availability would sustain connection. They refused to reciprocate. This dynamic gave them everything they wanted: relationship without vulnerability, connection without obligation, intimacy without the emotional exposure that intimacy typically requires. You have tried every strategy to shift this imbalance, communicating your needs more clearly, establishing boundaries you then failed to enforce, giving space while remaining emotionally available, being patient and understanding, while hoping your acceptance would create safety for them to lower their defenses. All these approaches failed because they maintained the fundamental dynamic where you remained invested while they remained defended, where you needed the relationship more than they did, where you worked harder to sustain connection than they worked. The power remained firmly in their defended hands as long as you continued pursuing, as long as you kept hoping, as long as you remained available despite their consistent unavailability. Then you execute the ultimate reversal that flips the entire dynamic in ways the avoidant never anticipated, and their defensive structure has no mechanisms to manage. You stop pursuing and become genuinely unavailable in ways that mirror their patterns back to them. You give them the space they claim to want and maintain that space permanently rather than temporarily. You stop explaining your position and simply disappear without the justifications they could argue against. You treat their eventual return with the same indifference they demonstrated throughout the relationship. You build life that proves you not only survive without them, but actively thrive in ways that expose they were the limited party all along. This reversal strips the avoidant of every source of power they wielded, forces them to experience their own patterns from the receiving end, eliminates the safety net they unconsciously depended upon, and creates the only conditions where the avoidant must face actual consequences for their defended position, rather than continuing patterns that cost them nothing while costing you everything. Become as unavailable as they were, genuinely. The avoidant maintained emotional unavailability throughout the relationship, demonstrating through consistent behavior that they could not or would not provide adequate presence, despite your needs and despite your communication of those needs. They remained defended against intimacy, withheld emotional access, created distance whenever connection threatened to deepen beyond their defended comfort zone. This unavailability served as their primary source of power because it kept you in position of pursuing someone who retreated, of needing someone who remained detached, of investing in someone who offered minimal reciprocation. The avoidant's comfort with their own unavailability contrasted sharply with your discomfort with disconnection, creating asymmetry that gave them complete control over the relationship's emotional temperature. The biggest reversal involves matching their unavailability with your own, not as strategic performance designed to make them chase you, not as temporary withdrawal intended to teach them a lesson, but as genuine redirection of your emotional energy away from them and toward yourself and your own life. This authentic unavailability requires completing internal work of releasing them, accepting that they cannot meet your needs, choosing yourself with conviction that no longer wavers based on whether they notice your absence or respond to your distance. You must become actually unavailable rather than performing unavailability while secretly hoping they will pursue, actually disengaged rather than strategically distant while monitoring whether your withdrawal generates their investment. This genuine unavailability manifests through complete cessation of the behaviors that maintained your investment throughout the relationship. You stop checking whether they have reached out. You cease monitoring their activities or attempting to gather information about their life. You redirect the mental energy you spent thinking about them toward investments in your own development, relationships, and pursuits. You stop organizing your choices around what they might think or whether they might notice. You become as thoroughly disengaged from them as they were disengaged from you throughout the relationship, matching their emotional distance with equivalent distance that reflects actual release rather than strategic positioning. The reversal's power emerges from the avoidant recognizing that you have become as comfortable with disconnection as they claim to be, that you can sustain absence of contact as easily as they sustained it, that you no longer need them in ways that gave them power throughout the relationship. The avoidant faces that their primary tool for maintaining control, their comfort with distance that contrasted with your discomfort, has been neutralized. You are no longer the pursuing party who needs connection more than they do. You have become equally or more comfortable with disconnection, shifting power dynamic completely, because the avoidant's defended position only provided power when someone else was uncomfortable with distance and working to eliminate it. Your genuine unavailability also forces the avoidant to experience what their patterns felt like from your position throughout the relationship. The avoidant encounters someone who is emotionally distant, who does not reciprocate their occasional gestures of connection, who remains defended against intimacy they might attempt to initiate. This mirror of their own behavior creates discomfort the avoidant has never experienced because they have always been the unavailable party. The avoidant discovers that being on the receiving end of emotional unavailability generates anxiety, confusion, and desire for connection they could not access when they were the ones maintaining distance. This forced empathy through direct experience reveals to the avoidant what their patterns cost you, though this recognition typically arrives too late to repair the damage already done. The genuine quality of your unavailability becomes evident through the sustained consistency with which you maintain it. Strategic unavailability wavers when the avoidant reaches out, softens when they display vulnerability, dissolves when they make promises of change. Genuine unavailability remains constant, regardless of the avoidant's response, because it reflects your actual internal state rather than tactic designed to manipulate their behavior. You maintain your unavailability when they contact you with casual messages, when they suddenly display vulnerability they withheld for years, when they promise transformation you no longer believe they can sustain. Your consistent unavailability communicates that you have genuinely released them rather than strategically withdrawn. This matching of their unavailability also demonstrates that you possess the very independence and self-sufficiency the avoidant claimed to value throughout the relationship. The avoidant maintained that they needed space, that they valued autonomy, that they preferred independence over entanglement. Your genuine unavailability shows that you possess these same qualities. You can be alone comfortably. You value your autonomy enough to protect it by removing yourself from relationship that threatened it. You prefer genuine independence over participating in relationship with someone who cannot reciprocate adequately. The avoidant faces that you embody the very characteristics they claimed made them incompatible with your needs, exposing that the incompatibility stemmed from their defensive limitations rather than from your legitimate requirements for partnership. Your unavailability becomes particularly powerful when the avoidant recognizes it is not punishment or revenge, but rather self-protection and self-respect. You are not withholding availability to hurt them or to make them experience what you experienced. You are unavailable because you have chosen yourself, because you recognize that relationship with them depletes rather than nourishes you, because you understand that accepting their limitations means removing yourself from situations where those limitations harm you. This self-protective unavailability cannot be argued against or characterized as unreasonable because it simply reflects you honoring your own needs and worth in ways the avoidance patterns prevented you from doing throughout the relationship. Understanding how to become genuinely unavailable requires recognizing that this transformation must be authentic rather than performed. The avoidant will sense if you are strategically creating distance while remaining emotionally invested, will recognize if your unavailability serves as tactic rather than reflecting genuine internal shift. You must do the actual internal work of releasing them, processing the relationship, grieving the loss, accepting their limitations, choosing yourself with conviction, before your unavailability will carry the authentic quality that creates reversal. Performed unavailability gives the avoidant power by revealing you remain invested beneath the performance. Genuine unavailability strips them of all power by demonstrating you have moved beyond investing in someone who cannot reciprocate adequately. Give them the space they claim to want, permanently. Throughout the relationship, the avoidant claimed to need space, insisted that others wanted too much closeness, maintained that their withdrawal served legitimate need for autonomy rather than reflecting defensive avoidance of intimacy. They positioned your desire for connection as pressure that justified their distance, characterized your needs for presence as demands that exceeded what reasonable person should require, presented their withdrawal as appropriate boundary setting that you should respect rather than question. The avoidant used their claimed need for space as weapon that kept you constantly adjusting yourself to accommodate their defended position, always giving them room while hoping that sufficient space would eventually allow them to move closer. The ultimate reversal involves taking the avoidant at their word and giving them exactly what they claim to want, space, but giving it to them permanently rather than temporarily, completely rather than partially, infinitely rather than in the measured doses you provided throughout the relationship, while maintaining your availability. You stop the pattern of giving space for brief periods before attempting to restore connection. Stop the cycle of backing off, only to cautiously approach again when you sense their defenses have lowered. Instead, you give them the space they claim to need and maintain that space indefinitely, creating distance that has no planned endpoint, that does not serve as pause before reconnection, that represents actual space rather than strategic distance. This permanent provision of space eliminates the safety net the avoidant unconsciously depended upon throughout the relationship. While you gave space temporarily before attempting to restore connection, the avoidant could withdraw knowing that you would eventually bridge the distance, that the space would be brief, that your pursuit would resume. This knowledge that space was temporary allowed the avoidant to withdraw without facing genuine risk of permanent loss. When you give space permanently, when you maintain distance indefinitely without any attempts to restore connection, the avoidant loses the security that temporary space provided. They face that the space they claim to want has become actual disconnection rather than manageable distance, that their withdrawal has finally generated the permanent consequence their temporary withdrawals never produced. The permanent space also forces the avoidant to confront whether they actually wanted space or whether they wanted control over intimacy's progression. The avoidant claimed throughout the relationship that they needed space, yet their behavior suggested they wanted space on their terms, space when it suited them, space that you would eliminate when they decided they wanted connection, space that gave them power to determine when intimacy occurred without requiring them to pursue or demonstrate desire. Permanent space removes this control entirely. The avoidant has all the space they claim to want, yet that space now includes your complete absence, your lack of pursuit, your unwillingness to bridge the distance they created. The avoidant discovers that space without the option of restoring connection on their terms feels entirely different from the controlled distance they maintained throughout the relationship. Giving permanent space also demonstrates that you take their stated preferences seriously, rather than constantly trying to change or accommodate them. Throughout the relationship, you gave space reluctantly while hoping they would want less of it, accommodated their need for distance while wishing they would want more closeness, respected their withdrawal while believing it was temporary defensive reaction rather than genuine preference. This accommodating stance communicated that you did not truly accept their stated need for space, but rather tolerated it while hoping it would change. Permanent space communicates that you have accepted their stated preference completely. They want space. You are providing exactly that, and you are no longer attempting to modify their preference or hoping it will spontaneously shift to align with your needs for connection. The permanence of the space becomes clear through your complete lack of attempts to restore connection, your absence of checking whether they want to re-engage, your failure to create situations where reconnection might occur. The avoidant recognizes that you are not giving them space temporarily as tactic to make them miss you, but rather are giving them space permanently because you have accepted that their stated need for space indicates they are not compatible with your need for connection. This recognition that the space is genuinely permanent rather than strategically temporary creates panic in the avoidant that temporary space never generated, because temporary space always included implicit promise that you would eventually attempt to restore connection. The permanent space also eliminates the avoidant's ability to return to connection on their terms when their defended comfort requires brief engagement before they withdraw again. Throughout the relationship, the avoidant could create space when intimacy felt threatening and could return to connection when isolation became uncomfortable, with your pursuit and availability making this fluctuation possible. Permanent space means the avoidant cannot simply decide they want connection and expect you to be available to provide it. You have given them the space they claim to want, and that space now includes your unavailability, meaning the avoidant must actively pursue if they want connection rather than passively receiving connection you maintain through your effort. Giving permanent space also forces the avoidant to sit with the actual consequences of their stated preferences. The avoidant claimed throughout the relationship that they preferred space and independence over intimacy and connection. Permanent space tests whether this stated preference reflects genuine desire or defensive rationalization. If the avoidant genuinely prefers space, they should experience relief and satisfaction with the permanent distance you have created. If the avoidant experiences distress, if they attempt to restore connection, if they demonstrate through their response that permanent space is not actually what they want, their stated preferences are exposed as defensive narratives rather than authentic desires. Either outcome provides clarity. The avoidant either thrives in the permanent space, confirming their stated preferences were genuine, or they struggle with the space, revealing their claimed need for distance was defensive rather than authentic. Understanding how to give permanent space requires recognizing that this reversal demands genuine internal acceptance, that the avoidant cannot meet your needs, rather than strategic positioning designed to make them want you more. Permanent space is not tactic to make them chase you, but rather authentic acceptance. That relationship with someone who consistently needs space you cannot comfortably give is not sustainable. You must genuinely accept that their need for space, whether defensive or authentic, makes them incompatible with your need for connection. And this acceptance must lead to actual permanent distance rather than to temporary withdrawal that you secretly hope will generate their pursuit. The reversal works because it gives them exactly what they claim to want while simultaneously eliminating the control dynamic where they had space on their terms with your availability, ensuring they never faced genuine consequences of their stated preferences. Stop explaining and start disappearing. Throughout the relationship, you provided extensive explanations for your feelings, your needs, your hurt about the avoidance patterns. You articulated why their withdrawal wounded you, why their emotional unavailability felt like rejection, why their inconsistency created anxiety. You explained your boundaries when you attempted to establish them, justified your needs when you expressed them, defended your perceptions when the avoidant questioned them. This pattern of explanation gave the avoidant material to work with. They could argue against your reasoning, could suggest alternative interpretations of their behavior, could use your words against you by characterizing your explanations as pressure or demands. Your explanations also communicated continued investment because people who no longer care do not spend energy explaining themselves. The ultimate reversal involves stopping all explanation and simply disappearing from the avoidant's life without justification, without final conversation about why you are leaving, without detailed articulation of how their patterns hurt you. You execute what the avoidant has done throughout the relationship, creating distance without explanation, becoming unavailable without justifying that unavailability, withdrawing without providing the closure that explanation offers. This unexplained disappearance mirrors the avoidant's own patterns back to them, forcing them to experience the confusion and anxiety that withdrawal without explanation generates, denying them the opportunity to argue against reasoning you have not provided or to use your words to deflect from their behavior. The power of disappearing without explanation emerges from how completely it denies the avoidant their usual defensive mechanisms. When you explained your hurt, the avoidant could minimize your pain by suggesting you were too sensitive. When you articulated why their patterns were harmful, the avoidant could argue that their behavior was justified given their limitations. When you expressed why you needed to leave, the avoidant could attempt to convince you to stay or could use your reasons as material for reframing themselves as victim. Disappearing without explanation eliminates all these defensive options. The avoidant has nothing to argue against, nothing to minimize, nothing to reframe. Your absence speaks for itself, while your silence denies them access to the explanations they could use to avoid accountability. The unexplained disappearance also communicates that the avoidant no longer merits the emotional labor that explanation requires. Throughout the relationship, you expended tremendous energy trying to make the avoidant understand your experience, attempting to help them see how their patterns affected you, hoping that sufficient explanation would generate the insight that motivated change. This investment in explaining demonstrated that you believed the avoidant was worth that effort, that you thought understanding could improve the relationship, that you maintained hope that explaining would eventually break through their defenses. Stopping all explanation and simply disappearing communicates that you no longer consider them worth that investment, that you have accepted explanation will not generate change, that you have released hope that they will ever truly understand what their patterns cost you. The disappearance without explanation also forces the avoidant to sit with uncertainty that you experience throughout the relationship. The avoidant's unexplained withdrawals left you confused about what you did wrong, anxious about whether they would return, uncertain about what their distance meant. You spent countless hours analyzing their behavior, trying to understand their patterns, attempting to decode what their withdrawal communicated. Your disappearance without explanation creates identical experience for the avoidant. They do not know exactly why you left, cannot pin your departure on specific grievance they could address, face uncertainty about whether you might return. This forced experience of the confusion their own patterns generated provides harsh education about how their unexplained withdrawals affected you. The avoidant's typical response to others' departures involves focusing on how the person left rather than examining why the person left. When you explain your reasons for leaving, you provide the avoidant with material to critique. They can suggest you left too hastily, that you did not give them adequate chance to change, that you were too demanding in your expectations. This focus on your delivery of the departure allows the avoidant to avoid examining their own patterns that necessitated the departure. When you disappear without explanation, you eliminate the avoidant's ability to focus on how you left. They have nothing to critique about your delivery because you simply became unavailable without fanfare or justification. This absence of explanation forces the avoidant, if they possess any capacity for self-reflection, to examine their own behavior rather than deflecting by critiquing yours. The unexplained disappearance also denies the avoidant the closure that explanation provides. Throughout the relationship, you provided closure for the avoidant's withdrawals by doing the work of reconnection, by interpreting their distance charitably, by accepting their eventual return without requiring explanation for their absence. This provision of closure allowed the avoidant to withdraw and return as their defenses required, without ever having to articulate their patterns or take responsibility for the disruption those patterns created. Your disappearance without explanation leaves the avoidant without closure, without understanding of exactly what went wrong, without clear endpoint that explanation would provide. This lack of closure creates discomfort that persists because the avoidant cannot neatly file away the relationship as finished when so many questions remain unanswered. Your disappearance without explanation also preserves your dignity in ways that lengthy explanations often compromise. When you explain extensively why you are leaving, when you detail all the ways the avoidant hurt you, when you articulate your pain about their patterns, you risk appearing desperate for their understanding, as if their acknowledgement of your hurt would somehow validate your decision to leave. Disappearing without explanation communicates that you do not need their understanding, do not require their acknowledgement of your pain, do not seek their validation of your decision. You are simply gone, and whether they understand why or not is no longer your concern. This preservation of dignity while executing your exit creates impression of strength that lengthy explanations never achieve. Understanding how to stop explaining and start disappearing requires recognizing that this reversal demands genuine internal acceptance, that explaining will not generate the understanding or change you once hoped for. You must release investment in making the avoidant understand what their patterns cost you, must accept that they either cannot or will not achieve the insight that explanation was supposed to create, must recognize that your departure serves your own well-being rather than serving as lesson for them. The disappearance without explanation works as reversal because it treats the avoidant exactly as they treated you, becoming unavailable without justification, withdrawing without explanation, creating distance that the other person must simply accept without understanding, while simultaneously demonstrating that you no longer consider them worth the emotional labor that explanation requires. Treat their return with the indifference they showed you. The avoidant will likely return after sensing you have genuinely released them, after recognizing that you have become authentically unavailable, after facing that their patterns have finally generated consequence they cannot ignore. This return may manifest as casual message testing whether you remain accessible, as sudden display of vulnerability designed to reactivate your hope, as promises of transformation intended to restore your investment. Throughout the relationship, you responded to the avoidant's minimal gestures with enthusiasm and relief, interpreted their brief returns as evidence of their capacity for change, met their inconsistent availability with grateful acceptance that reinforced their patterns by demonstrating those patterns cost them nothing. The ultimate reversal involves treating the avoidant's return with the same indifference they demonstrated toward you throughout the relationship. When they reach out, you respond with the emotional flatness they displayed when you expressed your feelings. When they display vulnerability, you receive it with the detached coolness they showed when you shared yours. When they promise change, you respond with the skepticism and disinterest that mirrors how they dismissed your needs. This matching of their indifference creates devastating reversal because the avoidant encounters their own patterns reflected back to them, experiences how their emotional unavailability felt from your position, faces that their gestures toward connection now generate the same minimal response that your gestures generated throughout the relationship. This indifferent response to their return specifically denies them the enthusiastic reception they unconsciously expect and depend upon. The avoidant's entire defensive strategy throughout the relationship relied on your warm reception of their minimal efforts, on your interpretation of their slight movements toward you as significant progress, on your willingness to meet their inconsistent availability with consistent investment. When you respond to their return with indifference, when you treat their outreach as unremarkable rather than as meaningful gesture, when you fail to provide the enthusiasm that previously rewarded their minimal effort, you eliminate the dynamic that allowed their patterns to continue without consequence. This indifferent treatment of their return also forces the avoidant to experience the powerlessness you experienced throughout the relationship. When you pursued them with enthusiasm and they responded with indifference, you felt powerless to generate the response you hoped for, helpless to create the connection you needed, frustrated by your inability to make them care as much as you cared. Your indifferent response to their return creates identical experience for the avoidant. They discover that their outreach generates no enthusiasm, that their vulnerability creates no softening in your position, that their promises produce no hope. They experience the frustration of wanting response they cannot generate, of offering what once would have been received eagerly only to encounter disinterest that reveals how thoroughly you have moved beyond them. Understanding how to treat the avoidant's return with indifference requires recognizing that this response must be authentic rather than performed to be effective as reversal. The avoidant will sense if you are performing indifference while remaining emotionally invested, will recognize if your coolness serves a strategy to hurt them rather than reflecting genuine disinterest. You must have completed the internal work of releasing them before your indifferent response will carry the authentic quality that creates reversal. Performed indifference gives them hope because it reveals you remain affected by them enough to perform. Authentic indifference strips them of all power because it demonstrates you have genuinely moved beyond, caring about their patterns, their promises, or their attempts to restore connection that you no longer want or need.